Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts. Now, here's Jim Dubois.
We're here at the legendary Minneapolis nightclub First Avenue, where former Mayor RT Rybak will celebrate the launch of his new book, Pothole Confidential, My Life as Mayor of Minneapolis, on April 13th. This month on Access Minnesota, we sit down with Rybak to talk about his new book, his legacy as mayor of Minneapolis, and his new role as executive director of Generation Next. RT Rybak served as mayor of Minneapolis from 2002 to 2014. He is currently the executive director of Generation Next, and he has a new book coming out this month on University of Minnesota Press. It's titled Pothole Confidential, My Life as Mayor of Minneapolis. The book release party is right here at First Avenue on April 13th. Mr. Mayor, welcome to Access Minnesota.
It's good to be here, and people should know that First Avenue doesn't smell of stale beer during the day. It smells like a good, wonderful, clean club that it will be. So I hope people can come to the party.
Let's start with the title of your memoir, Pothole Confidential. How much of the job as mayor of Minneapolis actually involves fixing potholes and street maintenance?
Well, a fair amount, but the title actually came from my wife. You know, the book Kitchen Confidential and Inside Stories and all that. She thought, okay, what would it be for mayors? And she kind of jokingly said, Pothole Confidential, but everyone liked it. Now, in reality, potholes do have a lot to do with it. And part of what a mayor has to do is to be the very visible face on these big public issues that you see on the news at night and that. But there's also the basics of running a city. Good streets, good snow plowing, clean water, all of those matter. So potholes do matter a lot. And by the way, we did a lot on potholes when I was mayor, but we still have some to take care of. So,
there have been cases in this country in the past where poor snow plowing or response to a blizzard has actually done a mayoral administration in. Did you feel that kind of pressure whenever there was a heavy snowfall in Minnesota or after the snow season and it was time to fill the multitude of potholes?
Every time it snowed and every time the snow melted and there were potholes, yes, I did feel my job was on the line, and it should. That's the way it should be. That with most jobs, it's kind of tough to figure out exactly what is that way to measure it. But with a mayor, more than any other political office that I know of, you're right there on the point. So if the street isn't plowed, you go to the mayor. Potholes not fixed, you go there. If your community's not safe. And I like that about that because you're held accountable. And part of the beauty of local government is you deal with things that touch people's lives every day. So I try to spend a lot of time on the big things that, again, people saw in the news. But I knew that unless you were running the city well and people felt those basic things were taken care of, you wouldn't be very comfortable in your job.
Prior to your run for office, you were in journalism and internet broadcasting. What made you decide to venture into politics?
Well, I wanted to be mayor from a really early age, and I think it comes from the fact that I was fortunate enough to grow up really immersed in the city, not in politics, but in the different parts of life. So I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in South Minneapolis, but my parents had a corner drugstore, first where the freeway is now, and then over at Chicago and Franklin when it was a pretty violent part of town. And so I saw two sides of Minneapolis from a very early age, and I think that really gave me the insight pretty early that not everybody was as fortunate or privileged as I was. I also knew people who were a lot more so than me too. So I sort of saw that our communities operate on different levels, and I think that's really been at the core of why I've done what I've done all these years. I wanted the city to be better, and I wanted people to be able to have an equal experience. And then I just happen to love Minneapolis and Minnesota, and I think that kind of all added up to wanting to be a mayor. It's not how it wasn't simple to get there because I did all these other things in the middle, but I got there eventually.
What were some of the earliest lessons that you learned about city politics once you got into office?
Well, I learned a lot of lessons because I had never run for office before. I'd never held office before. I walked in right after 9/11. I, in fact, won the primary on 9/11. The city's budget was in turmoil, so there was a lot of stuff going on. And I did the best I could. But, you know, on a lot of levels, I was a little bit over my head in those first few months. And one of the first lessons I learned is I'm going to make mistakes here. I've got to do my best to admit it. And then the one thing that I can do is to show up. You know, whether I was doing everything right or not, people knew where I was. I was visible. I was out at the crime scene. I was out when there was a community meeting. If people were mad, I was there. And a lot of times they give you advice in politics, don't be around all the bad news. Well, I thought that was a big thing. I was there. For better or worse, people knew I was on the job. And then the second thing, and this came a little bit later, really especially after I won my first re-election. Even if I had disappointed a lot of people, I wound up winning by a lot, which was surprising to me. And I thought a lot of people who I disagreed with or had to make a tough decision on would desert me. But most didn't, which was just amazing to me. And I think, and I wrote in that book, I have a chapter called The Thin Line Between Love and Respect. And that's when I think I crossed that line and recognized I don't need to be loved. And in fact, that's not the job. The job is to do things that people will respect. And so that meant, in many cases, doing things that an individual may disagree with, but hopefully they would respect the whole body of work. That was a big learning.
When you first came to office, the city was deep in debt. Moody's Investor Service even downgraded the city's bond rating. How did you repair the city's finances?
Well, you know, I walked in with absolutely zero background in public finance, but I had been a person who'd run businesses, had been around businesses, and in general felt that government needs to do a better job of making a deal with people. I'm going to ask you to deliver some money for the common good, and in return, I sure as heck better use that well. And I don't think in politics people make that deal with people enough. So that means, in my mind, being really open about how the money is being spent and being really tough-minded about that. I'm actually pretty progressive on almost every social issue, but financially, I felt it was important to be really tough. So, coming into a mess, I frankly didn't have an option. Every decision was going to be tough, and every decision was going to make somebody angry. So I thought, okay, if I just kind of put all the noise outside of it, listen to everybody's opinion, but then kind of shut the door with smart people and lay out a plan that wound up being a lot of tough medicine for people, but it wound up paying off a lot of debt. We paid off or avoided, I think, about $300 million in debt when I was there. We restored the bond ratings. More important, we delivered balanced budgets. We reformed different departments. We launched a 311 system so people could get their calls answered. We did results-based management, which meant that we had key indicators for each area. We really focused on run the city well. You can do some things that people don't agree with as long as they know I'm giving this person my hard-earned tax dollars, and they sure better give me a good return on it.
What were some of the toughest fiscal decisions you had to make as mayor?
Wow. Well, they started early. When I came into office, not only was the city in debt, but the previous city council and mayor were in a fight, and they just couldn't finish the budget. So in the first 2 weeks, I had to cut $5 million out of the previous year's budget, and then it went south from there. So I had to take pretty much everything. In fact, a lot of things I cared a lot about. I cared a lot about neighborhood revitalization, but that program's funding had been cut out by the legislature, so we had to restructure that. Made a lot of people mad. We had to say to people who were doing good work, I'm going to have to ask you to help me reinvent the way our whole economic development functions work in the city so that it's easier to open a business here and to grow a business here. I had to make a lot of tough decisions. You mentioned potholes. I had to take a bunch of money we had for economic growth for a bunch of cool new buildings and new housing that we could have built, and instead pull it back into core services like fixing streets and street repairs. I, especially when we had a crime wave, had to find a way to put more money into policing, and so that meant actually taking some of that money that was in our fund to pave streets and moving it over to police. You know, you're never able to make that easy a decision. And so I just got very used to making tough ones.
When Access Minnesota returns, Rybak tells us about the process of compromising with state Republican leadership.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Now more of Access Minnesota, where former Minneapolis Mayor RT Rybak talks about the challenges of compromising with state Republican leadership. Much of your tenure as mayor was served under the administration of Republican Governor Tim Pawlenty. How did you work with the state Republican leaders back then?
Yeah, well, you know, the first part of it was under Jesse Ventura, and Governor Ventura and I disagreed with a number of issues, but I think I worked very well with their administration. They were fair, I was fair, we had different perspectives, and we talked about it. When Governor Pawlenty came in, he and a lot of people who ran for the legislature ran on, in some cases, very literally an anti-Minneapolis platform. It's kind of easy, you know, when you're not getting votes from the big city to kind of dump on the big city. So came in with a real vengeance and immediately took a cut at the partnership the city and the state have through what's called local government aid. That wound up, however, also hurting cities across the state. And so I formed a partnership with them. Basically, the idea is this, is that the city of Minneapolis sends a bunch of money over to the state, and then we get a little bit back in local government aid, about a third of what we send over. The governor cut that aid pretty deeply, and so we were sending a whole lot of money over and getting none, well, much less back. Because cities led by people with lots of different political backgrounds, we're all in the same boat. It was really powerful to go around the state and build these partnerships with people who I was in a different political alignment with, but together we could go back to the legislature, and eventually over many years we fought to get more of that partnership with the cities and the state rebuilt, but it took a long time.
That rift, as you mentioned, between Greater Minnesota and the metro area, particularly the city of Minneapolis, continues today. We see it manifesting itself in the current legislative session. Do you think that rift will ever be smoothed over?
Well, you know, yes, the short answer is yes. And I think part of it is people have to come to the table with a different attitude. Minneapolis is the largest city in the state. I felt had been pretty arrogant. And so I made a huge effort to try to humbly be part of partnerships. And I met just some great people. In fact, just a few minutes ago, Dave Schmiglewski, who was the mayor then of Granite Falls, gave me a call. And I worked a lot with Mayor Ness up in Duluth, or Mayor Walden in Waseca, or I could go on and on. All these really great mayors around the state. That really helped a lot. And I think these personal relationships, I think also being attuned to the differences in the communities. If I wanted people to understand that Minneapolis had some unique and difficult issues, especially with poverty and race and culture and a lot of others, I sure as heck better be able to at least be fluent in what does agriculture policy mean for Main Street, Minnesota? What does it mean when you have to deliver services over dramatically more geographic boundaries in the city? It's one thing for me to figure out how to get emergency response in an ambulance in the city that's filled with different doctors and hospitals and clinics and ambulances and such. But it's very different when you're having to drive hundreds of miles. If you don't get that as a mayor of a big city, you don't deserve to be part of a partnership. So I spent a lot of time trying to understand those issues.
Minneapolis has a weak mayor, strong city council structure. How did you navigate this system when you were mayor?
Well, the first thing was I really looked at that system and said, for years people have been saying this is a weak mayor, strong council system, but it's really not. It's a weak mayor, weak council, weak city coordinator, diffused system. And the only way to get anything done is to build a partnership. So the mayor has some real power in the city of Minneapolis. You do the budget, you appoint department heads, you chair an executive committee that different departments report to. But the power is spread all out. So I found that it was especially good when you could bring people in. So what I did was, unlike previously when the mayor did the budget and then presented it to the city council, I did the budget in partnership with the council. I brought committee chairs into my budget hearings and really, before I presented a budget, worked out a lot of things that we would agree or disagree on as I was forming the budget. So having those voices with me at the table as I was making decisions was not really about giving up power, it was about doing the art of what was possible. So I built that coalition before it came out. That helped a lot. And I guess that was part of it is recognizing you can't do any one thing alone. And that's true in all forms of government, but it was certainly true in mine. So I helped form the Regional Mayors Association, which brought metropolitan mayors together. I was part of something called the Itasca Group, which was business leaders. Greater MSP, which was economic growth leaders. Generation Next, that I now lead, was about getting education partners together. So I realized pretty early that if you want to get something done, you had to get outside of City Hall, well, and build partnerships both inside City Hall and outside of City Hall.
Since the shooting of Jamar Clark this fall, tensions have been high between the police and the Northside community. As mayor, how did you act as an intermediary between the community and the police?
Yeah, well, this latest incident is tragic and really complex. It's not in a vacuum, and I think one of the reasons there's so much energy and concern around it is that this is not the first time we've talked about police and community relations in Minneapolis. As I say in the book, when I was a reporter at the Star Tribune back in 1979 and 80, there were huge issues with both people of color, especially African Americans in the police, and the gay and lesbian community and the police. The gay, lesbian, transgender community improved dramatically. In fact, there's now the first openly lesbian police chief in the country happens to be a chief in Minneapolis, and up and down the pike. Great progress has been made. That has not been matched with communities of color, specifically African Americans in Minneapolis. We have a serious issue. There are many ways that we tried to address that. And recruitment, policy changes, many other things I could go through. And there are incredibly good one-off examples of people coming together across racial lines of the police and the community, but not enough. And there's a lot within that. There's the issue of racism within policing, which in some cases is valid and true. In some cases, it's really unfair to lead on police officers. There are many issues about what the drug war has done. I mean, this is a big part of it. And in the book, I spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. There's a chapter called A Safe Place to Call Home that I rewrote several times as things began to unfold, especially around the country. Ferguson, Baltimore, Minneapolis. I really felt I wanted to write something that gave people insight into what is a police officer's life like in the context of all of these issues broiling, and what is the experience like for a person in the community. I've been neither of those people, but I've been navigating on some level trying to hold that together for a long time. So I spent a lot of time thinking about what I wrote on that, and there's no magic in what I wrote, but it is, I think, an attempt to try to contribute to what I think is just, we have to move further on all of this. And I think part of it is for people to look across a divide and see someone who's a human being and not a uniform or a protest sign. And to recognize that when a person of color comes into an interaction with a police officer, it's not starting at zero. It's not just about that. It's years of things that have been pent up. And I think one of the sad facts is for many, many years, we've been hearing allegations of incidents that now we're seeing validated on videotape. All this camera work, all these videos we're seeing are very painful, but it is much better than when we didn't. And to actually have that validation and to understand the motivations and get at that is part of healing. It's not easy and it's not comfortable, but that's part of the point.
Did writing this book make you consider what your legacy as mayor might be?
Well, I always said I know exactly what I want my legacy to be, that the one program more than anything else I'm most proud of is Step Up. It's a summer job program, and we put 22,000 kids into summer jobs, and 86% of them are kids of color. And in fact, the person working at the bank I was just at was a Step Up intern for 3 years. That makes me feel good. But generally, I want to, I guess, write a book that said it's not like one thing, or frankly, I mean, I wrote the book and my picture's on the cover, but it's not really about me. It's when you get things done, you really recognize that as much as we get these images of, oh, this person is a successful or a not successful politician, neither is true. It's whether you help create a climate of leadership where a whole lot of things happen. So the thing I'm happy about is that I think I helped bring out the best in Minneapolis, but I didn't do it alone.
When Access Minnesota returns, we'll hear about former Minneapolis Mayor RT Rybak's plans for the future and a possible bid for higher office.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Now back to our conversation with former Minneapolis Mayor RT Rybak about his new book, Pothole Confidential, My Life as Mayor of Minneapolis. Oftentimes when a politician writes a book, it foreshadows an interest in running for a higher office.
Right.
Do you have interest in running for a higher office?
I'll probably run for something again someday, but if I was going to run for office, I would not written this kind of book. I really did my very best to put a wall around myself as I was doing it. I'm a former journalist. I said, okay, pretend you're a journalist, not a washed up politician telling war stories, because political biographies can be deadly. You know, I don't like reading them myself. So I said, okay, just try to tell the truth and see where that comes to. So I went to places that you would not exactly want, your campaign manager would not be advising you to admit so many mistakes or, you know, some of the other things they did, which was good. I mean, I just wanted it to be what I perceived to be the truth. Now, other people are going to perceive a different truth, but it wasn't about political next steps or anything else. It was just saying that at this point, while it's still fresh, I want to tell the story because people pay a lot of money for government. They should know what the heck they're getting.
Tell us about your current work at Generation Next and how the organization carries on some of the initiatives that you launched while mayor.
Yeah, well, the thing that I'm really excited about is that you can never get everything done you wanted to get done. And now I get to work on something that's unfinished. You know, phenomenal city, Minneapolis. This region has the largest gap in outcomes in academics for kids of color of any in the country. So we have to get at that. So I now lead a coalition of foundations, civic groups, individuals, businesses, all putting resources into the table, and we focus on everything from early childhood to career. So we're doing some work in Ready for Kindergarten on screening 3-year-olds and improving quality in childcare. We're doing some work in literacy and math, some really exciting work in high school graduation to identify kids when they get off track, some work in getting them through college, some fascinating work in social and emotional learning, and then trying to get all these different players who help kids aligned along some goals. That's really exciting work. It's hard work. It's definitely the hardest. And I've said it's the most political job I've ever had, not in a mean politics kind of way, but trying to get school systems and philanthropy and counties and cities and everyone all working together, you know, with the schools is super complex. But if it was easy, we probably would have made a lot more progress. But the good news is, I think as hard as the work is, we're getting an alignment of people. We can't mess around. We don't have time to waste. We can't experiment for a generation. We're going to win or lose now. So I feel that incredible urgency with what I do, and I'm happy to be on the point. I like doing that as mayor, and I feel equally accountable now. It's not as literal or obvious as a pothole or an unplowed street, but boy, a kid's future is a lot more important than even that.
Your book launch party takes place here at First Avenue on April 13th in the main room. Tell us about the musicians that'll be playing at the event and what else is in store for folks who stop by.
This is, the book launch is going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be here at First Avenue. And we'll have some great local musicians. I'll do some readings. We'll have some ice cream from Sebastian Joe's. But I think more than anything, it'll be a bit of a celebration of the city, hearing some great music and all. We're doing events too around the state that will be like that. I just spoke to the Independent Booksellers Association and began planning some really good events around the state. It's a book that's a lot about local. So it's about Minneapolis, but it's a lot about local. So for instance, we're planning one in Cambridge with a local winery and somebody who makes local pizzas. We're doing something in Excelsior and in, where else? Stillwater, I think, with some local breweries. We're talking to some people in other parts of the state about, to Duluth, I'm going to do a reading with Mayor Ness, who has a great new book, by the way. So we're trying to sort of make it a celebration of local around the state. So First Avenue will be fun, but so will those other events around the state.
Of course, the big question is, will there be any stage diving at the book release party?
Well, I'll let you in a little secret. What we're trying to do is, I have done a stage dive or two, or maybe 4 or 5 before, and I was going to retire it, but what we're thinking about, this is going to be a fundraiser for our summer job program, Step Up. So I'm thinking I might, if people contributed a certain amount, I might do book signings while stage diving, which as far as we know has never been done in this country, or in the world, I guess, you know. So we'll see about that. If it helps raise money for kids in the summer, I'll do it. And I'm not shy about that.
Former Minneapolis Mayor RT Rybak, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
Thank you very much.
That's all for this month's edition of Access Minnesota. We'll see you again next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.